Thank you, Kurt, and welcome everybody. It's great to see such a big crowd here this evening. I'm really delighted and very honoured to be introducing Philip McGowan's inaugural lecture as Professor of American Literature. And a special welcome, I know, to lots of members of his family, especially to Minnie, and to his brothers, Joseph and James. You're very welcome. So, as Kurt has already said, inaugurals were one of the many collegial activities put on hold during COVID. So Philip's lecture will be the amuse-bouche of a feast of inaugurals coming up in the next year or so. Thank you, Philip, for stepping up to the plate and being really the first of this set of inaugurals. Philip was brought up in Belfast, attending St Mary's Christian Brothers Grammar, from where he progressed to Trinity College Dublin to take his BA and his PhD in English. He was appointed to his first academic post in Goldsmiths College, London in 1998, a 9-month appointment which turned into a 7-year stay, during which, in addition to his core roles as a lecturer, he was chair of the University of London External Degree in English, which delivered degree-level education to over 800 students worldwide. He was lured back to his native city in 2005 when he was appointed senior lecturer in American literature here at Queen's and was promoted to a chair in 2020. As many of you will know, Philip's research focuses on 20th century American literature, both on fiction and poetry. In his first monograph, American Carnival, Seeing and Reading American Culture, and in much of his subsequent work on F. Scott Fitzgerald, material culture, especially embodied material culture such as alcohol, and identity politics around race, gender, and otherness are absolutely central to his approach. Following a series of articles and chapters on Fitzgerald, Philip edited the centenary edition of This Side of Paradise for Oxford University Press in 2020. This was followed in 2021 by editing the Penguin US edition of The Great Gatsby, which was the catalyst for an appearance on In Our Time to discuss Gatsby with Melvyn Bragg. He's currently co-editing the Routledge Companion to F. Scott Fitzgerald, which will be published to coincide with the centenary of The Great Gatsby in 2025. Philip's second monograph, Anne Sexton and Middle Generation Poetry, The Geography of Grief, unwrites confessional ways of reading poets like Sylvia Plath, John Berryman, and in this case, Anne Sexton. Sexton has remained pivotal to Philip's work, alongside 2 other poets of the mid-20th century, John Berryman and Elizabeth Bishop, where he has resituated their poetry in philosophical and theological contexts, notably in relation to Kierkegaard and Christianity and Judaism. Beyond his publications, Philip has made and continues to make a lasting contribution nationally and internationally to the wider field of American studies. Perhaps most significantly, as president of the European Association for American Studies since 2016, which is the world's largest American Studies association. He's the youngest and the first Irish president, as well as being the first to be elected to serve a second term through to 2024, during which his mission is to promote greater diversity in the association and to expand its networks in a number of the Balkan states and in Ukraine. When you read the list of destinations where Philip has given keynote lectures or held visiting professorships, Seattle, Alabama, Denver, Minnesota, Georgia, Minsk, Salzburg, Warsaw, Barcelona, it's evident that his work is known and admired in both North America and in Europe. Finally, I want to mention the broader contribution that Philip has made to Queen's. Obviously, a large proportion of his teaching is close to his research interests and covers 19th, 20th, and 21st century American literature, fields in which he has also supervised 12 PhDs. The interdisciplinarity that characterises Philip's research also made him the ideal colleague to develop a new liberal arts degree here at Queen's, which he has been running successfully for the last 5 years. I've known Philip since he came to Queen's in 2005, and have had the pleasure of working closely with him in the last couple of years in the faculty leadership team, in his role as Associate Dean for Internationalisation. But Philip has also stepped up and served in almost every role possible at school level, including Director of Education, Director of Internationalisation, and Subject Lead for English. I think it's fair to say that Philip is not known for his shy, retiring nature, but rather for his candour and his acerbic wit, both of which we all appreciate. His contributions across research, teaching, leadership and service here in Queen's are unfailingly underpinned by a deep commitment to his students, colleagues, and to his field of American literature. And on that note, I'll hand over to Professor Philip McGowan for his inaugural lecture, Literature and the Right to Write.
Difficult to vocalise and verbalise quite how I feel right now. I am going to take this jacket off though, because it's absolutely roasting down here. Thank you to Kurt as Head of Arts, English and Languages for putting this on and getting this show on the road. I'd like to thank Denise Toner, who is the kind of power behind the throne in Arts, English and Languages, for just being Denise Toner. She's amazing. Don't ever leave. Maria Meehan, you're up there at the door. You've sorted all this and sent out the invites and emailed people, and you're a star, and we love you. I'd like to thank Janice for embarrassing me. Words can't, I can't express how we all feel about you, Janice. We hold you in such high esteem. You're amazing. Sadly, this lecture has come over a quarter of a century too late for my mother to be here, but my daughter is here, and Minnie, you're the best person I know. Now, when I suggested that you all come to this, it's probably a bit late now to say that I was actually joking. And given that you're all here, it leaves me slightly lost for words, which is an inauspicious start to these events. It is honestly humbling to have so many people who have travelled so far as well. It is almost embarrassingly shocking that you've done that, but thank you. I really, really appreciate it. And if I don't get to talk to you later, thank you. I really appreciate it. I know also that some of my students are here, so there's a lot of colleagues here, but some of my students are here from previous times, previous students that I taught a long time ago who for some reason want to sit through one of these again, and also some of my current students. I'd like to give a special mention to the third year Stevens and Bishop class from this year. I can see there's three here. That's the rest of you are dotted around. I see Dylan, I see Adam. You are the single best class I've ever taught, whether in Dublin, in Goldsmiths, or here. So thank you for being you. And so as a nod of respect, I have structured this lecture around Stevens and Bishop. So we're going to set sail in a minute with a poem by Elizabeth Bishop. I'll make a bit of a turn with Emily Dickinson about halfway, and then I'll take us back to shore with Wallace Stevens. One of the very first events when I came to Queen's was actually the inaugural lecture of Paul Simpson, who's also here. He's travelled over from Liverpool on the boat. Thank you, Paul. Yeah, that was hilarious. It was one of the funniest evenings ever. I can guarantee I will not be as entertaining this evening. I am sorry. Although lecturing may sometimes appear to be like stand-up, but without the jokes, obviously. That is not my intention this evening. But I do want to stand up for literature, to make the case that keeps having to be made, I think, for the absolute centrality of literature and of art and of the arts more broadly to our very existence as human beings. When I mentioned a few months ago to my eldest brother, Joseph, yes, that I would be having this inaugural, he very helpfully recommended that I should not make this the academic equivalent of pulling teeth. So thank you for that. That's really helpful. I don't know how many of you are afflicted by having an eldest brother. It really is. It's quite the thing. So I've been doing this for 25 years. I think I'm getting there. Just think I'm getting there. Anyway, that said, as I was putting this together, I did have a very, very long delayed dental appointment because I had to get a molar redone. And thank you, the government, and lack of it locally, obviously. So teeth have been kind of on my mind a bit. I should probably promise to make this as painless as possible, but I don't think I'll be able to keep that. I should also note at this point that briefly, in a little while, I will be referring to child sexual abuse. Literature and art more generally interrogates the world as it is. And it has to do this if it is to retain its relevance to our understanding of what being is. And life, I'm afraid, is not without its darkest moments, and nor can literature. When I refer in my title this evening to the right to write, I also mean the right to read, the right to discuss, to teach, and to understand books and poems and plays, the narratives that we create about life. And when I say literature, I mean all forms of narratives, in all languages. Not just in English, though English is obviously my home, for want of a better term. My examples this evening, as you might expect, though, will come from American literature. That's been my field for the last 30 years since starting my PhD. But the points I will be making are not limited to that field in particular, or to the US or to English specifically, but to all texts in all forms and languages, to all of our forms of creating narrative about the experience of being alive in the world. So I will look at poems and fiction, certainly, and I'll be looking at 3 poems in particular quite quickly, and excerpts from 2 novels from this talk. But I'll also be speaking about the wider impulses and the far-reaching needs that we all have in forming and understanding narrative, whether that be in art or in song or film or in the arts more broadly defined. And the right to write is also the necessity to write, okay? To create and interrogate that which presents itself to us as being alive on this earth. Without literature, without art, we are diminished. Given that this lecture has been delayed by the pandemic, I thought I would start with a piece of research that has been delayed by the pandemic. It seemed quite appropriate. So in 2020, in this autumn of 2020, I was supposed to go to Clark University in the United States to do some research on something I thought I saw, or maybe I did see in a poem, a usually, as ever, deceptively brilliant, deceptively simple poem by Elizabeth Bishop. And it's called In the Waiting Room. Set in Worcester, Massachusetts, In the Waiting Room is a 99-line poem, the first 20 or so lines you see here. It was first published in the New Yorker on the 17th of July, 1971. It relates a visit to the dentist by a 6-year-old girl with her foolish, timid aunt, which becomes the platform for a discussion of female child psychology and the coming into self-awareness as she reads a copy of the National Geographic. Now, I don't think there's any occasion in which listening to Bishop read some of her work is not a good idea. So you're going to get the first 20 lines, hopefully.
In Worcester, Massachusetts, I went with Aunt Consuelo to keep her dentist appointment and sat and waited for her in the dentist's waiting room. It was winter, got dark early. The waiting room was full of grown-up people, arctics and overcoats, lamps and magazines. My aunt was inside what seemed like a long time, and while I waited, I read the National Geographic. I could read, and carefully studied the photographs. The inside of the volcano, black and full of ashes. Then it was spilling over in rivulets of fire.
And the poem concludes, as you see the last lines on the screen there. What happens is she reads the National Geographic, she hears an O of pain, she thinks it's her aunt, it's actually her, she faints, and then she comes back into the waiting room. And after she's fainted, it concludes, then I was back in it. The war was on, outside in Worcester, Massachusetts, where night and slush and cold, and it was still the 5th of February, 1918. That repetition of in Worcester, Massachusetts from the start and then at the end That got me thinking about, well, obviously repetition and Freud, and it got me also thinking about echoes and interiorities. There's so many in those first 20 lines in the waiting room in Worcester, Massachusetts, the inside of a volcano. So I was thinking about that, and I was thinking about psychology. I was thinking about Bishop's own long issue and attendance at psychoanalysis sessions during her life. And I thought about these. I started to do some digging, and I had a lot of the critical writing about In the Waiting Room jangling in my mind. Clark University, that I mentioned earlier, as it happens, was the only location in the United States that both Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud spoke at a psychology conference in 1909. Clark University is in Worcester, Massachusetts. There's a surprise. So that already had me interested. Is there something else going on in this poem? And the fact also that one of Jung's 3 lectures that he delivers at that conference was on female child psychology and introversion. Well, that gets me even more interested. Parallel this with the fact that Sigmund Freud suffered from maxillary jawbone cancer from about 1919, and as far as we know, had 306 dental appointments between 1923 and 1932. These things start to sort of begin to coalesce in my mind. And that mention of the war in the last lines, surely a remote reality to a 6-year-old in Worcester, Massachusetts, a town with a population of just short of 180,000 at the end of World War I. This concludes the poem with a very specific date stamp and reality check. Which brings me to the third man on the screen, Vahrastad Kazanjian. I'm sure you're all very familiar with his work. But he is a very famous, pioneering plastic surgeon for oral prostheses. Makes his name during World War I on the battlefields, constructing new mouths and gums and jaws for the soldiers who've been injured during battle. And he was praised by Sigmund Freud for 3 specific prostheses that he made for Freud in Vienna in 1931. Kazanjian went to visit him and stayed up awake for 2 nights making these special prostheses for Freud. 36 years previously, in 1895, Kazanjian had emigrated to the United States from Turkish Armenia. He was 16 years old, and he settles in Worcester, Massachusetts. Now, this is one brilliant poem with multiple intersecting realities and interpretations of being. One poem making trans-historical, transdisciplinary connections, and like the best poetry and the best art, asking us to look and look again, to see what it is that we think we see, and to see everything we may have elided by not being open to the revolutionary potential of every word, every image, every piece and moment of literature. If we have real-life psychologists congregating in Bishop's in the waiting room, Vladimir Nabokov's Lolita from 1955 carries a foreword by the fictional academic psychologist John Ray Jr., PhD. And in part, this veils what is an extraordinarily difficult text, as does Humbert Humbert's own fancy prose style throughout. At the core of this novel is a deeply horrific, traumatic set of experiences for the title character. It's a complex book to talk about because its subject is the sexual abuse and repeated sexual exploitation of at least one female child. The book's humour, and yeah, it is actually funny, I'm afraid to say, is disconcerting because through it we are led to sympathise or maybe understand Humbert Humbert. He makes up an excuse. Lolita's mother is kind of interested in him at the start of the novel, and he makes up an excuse. He's got a toothache. She says, shall we take these candles with us and sit for a while on the piazza, or do you want to go to bed and nurse that tooth? Nurse that tooth. But it's not the novel, really, that I want to talk about here, but a specific class on Lolita that I took here when it was a novel on a module I used to teach. Usually in my classes each week, 2 students do a presentation, and that's great. And usually at the start of the class, I go around and ask everyone else what their opinion is, so they all get to say something. That's the way it goes. At the very start of the semester, one of my female students asked me if she really wanted to do a presentation on Lolita. I said, fine, that's great. The week of the class, I go around, I ask everyone their opinions. There's a female mature student, just by chance, female and mature, who sat with her arms folded. And when I asked her what her opinion was, she said that she had refused to read that book and that she was there to register her disapproval of it being on the module. Fine, that's okay, that's okay. The student who had volunteered to present, I left to last. I just thought she can do her presentation. I could see she was visibly shaking, especially when she heard this mature student say what she had said. And it was soon then that we learned why. She gave a brilliant, devastating reading of this novel. It was brilliant. She found all the moments that are never really talked about in the novel. Lolita sobbing late into the night, the pain, the psychological trauma, the sexual violence. And she listed them all. She put them all together. And then she took the opportunity of this presentation to reveal publicly for the first time that she was the victim of child sexual abuse. It's not a moment I think I'll ever forget teaching in this university or any. The bravery of that choice, the courage of that student, the necessity of that moment, the absolute need that we have to have art that looks at every aspect of our world and of our lives, that facilitates discussion and hopefully a better understanding of the hardest things about who we are as human beings. In that novel, of all novels, life-changing literature. This lecture, though, is not going to be a journey through references to teeth. Well, it might be a wee bit. If you're familiar with my work in Escott Fitzgerald, I'm afraid I'm not going to discuss the molars that Wolfsheim has in his cufflinks. They've been done to death, as were the people who owned the molars. Neither will I be stopping to consider the moment in Toni Morrison's Beloved, where Beloved pulls out one of her own teeth. Beloved is one book of many books that is now banned in Florida. I prefer not to offer a token reference to Black experience in this lecture. Being Black is not, never has been, and never will be the same as being white in a white-dominated world. I do, though, want to say something about racism a little closer to home. The fact that a Black teenage schoolgirl here can be the subject of threats against her for legitimately raising concerns about the racist language in John Steinbeck's Of Mice and Men. This is just the other week. And then also about the consequent use of that racist terminology by her teacher and then by her peers. That this would happen in 2023. I have never, I don't think, ever been so ashamed to be from this place. And those of us who are from here, there's been a list. We have so far yet to travel as a society to make crusty old racists a thing of a bitter, divided past. But speaking of crusty old racists, George Washington, I don't want to offend any Americans in the audience, but he was. Washington was arguably the owner of the world's most famous, or America's most famous set of dentures. While not made from wood, as urban myth may have led some people to believe, it is unclear if any of the human teeth used for Washington's dentures came from Black people. Indeed, like many of his peers, Washington used dentures made from combinations of animal teeth, ivory, metal, and human teeth. What we do know is that in May 1784, a traveling dentist did extract teeth from slaves on Washington's own plantation for the sum total of £6 and 2 shillings. Differentiating the racial origins of Washington's dentures highlights some basic facts of our being human. I know that if any of you somehow had a bag of teeth and you came and put them in front of me here, I couldn't tell you who or what they came from. I couldn't tell you if they came from someone who was black or white, tall or small, gay, straight, transgender, Catholic, Protestant, funny, unfunny, affluent, educated? I just could not tell you. Similarly with blood, if you give me a pint of blood, I don't know what that's from. I could not tell you the class, gender, ethnic, or sexual orientation of where that pint of blood came from. So much of what makes us us and defines our being is a shared anatomical materiality. Teeth, blood, internal organs, bones. If you think for a moment of a skeleton, just imagine a skeleton. Yeah? We each have one. And with certain choices, I don't know how you're going to go out of this world. You might get cremated, so this mightn't apply. But as we depart this world, we potentially become skeletons, obviously. A skeleton, to my mind, is the entity that most represents our not being. Yeah? So if I try to imagine not being, I think of a skeleton. If I had a collection of bones up here with me, or even a full skeleton, there's little more than beyond that than ashes and dust that represents not being alive. And yet, the very fact of the absolute alterity to being, a skeleton not being, that exists at the core of each of us right now. You cannot sit there. I cannot stand here without a skeleton to frame the whole possibility of this. That which most defines our non-existence not only walks with us, it walks us day by day. Structures all of our movements. That which most arguably defines death, our death, is core to life, our lives. Our not being makes being possible. But there is another core to who we are as human beings. One that isn't physical, but no less is a source of visceral experiences. To access such metaphysical terrains, I nearly always choose to travel via Emily Dickinson. This world is not conclusion. A species stands beyond, invisible as music, but positive as sound. It beckons and it baffles. Philosophy, don't know. And through a riddle, at the last, sagacity must go. To guess it puzzles scholars. To gain it, men have borne contempt of generations and crucifixion shown. Faith slips and laughs and rallies, blushes if any see, plucks at a twig of evidence and asks a vain the way. Much gesture from the pulpit, strong hallelujahs roll. Narcotics cannot still the tooth that nibbles at the soul. There is no physical tooth here. This is not, or not just, a physical yearning. This is a metaphysical cavity that in part defines our understanding of this life. No legal or otherwise medication or prescription can satisfy or still this need that we have. For Emily Dickinson, I don't know how many of you have spent a lot of time with her poetry, but you should if you haven't. But anyway, for Dickinson, existence is more than just this life on earth, the time span of years we each live. Existence also includes the infinities before we were born and the eternities that follow our passing. And Dickinson's poetry continually takes us to these territories beyond lived experience. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. That's funny. That's a funny poem. I had the pleasure and the luxury and the privilege of being at my friend Adrian Street's Inaugural 2 weeks ago in Glasgow, and in one point he was talking about funny Puritans and funny Milton. I think there's a world of texts we could write. Funny Dickinson, like if there's any would-be PhD students in the audience, funny Dickinson. I could see the series now. I'd buy it. Might be alone there. Poetry, literature, music, art Each crystallizes the present moment, the moment of its articulation or creation, in languages that transcend the individual temporal moment and speak to us anew each time we look, we listen, and we read. That which matters, that which insists, that which will last is the core that we seek and which can provide a meaning beyond us and yet ourselves. Literature and art do not stop, cannot stop, because today needs articulation for today, just as tomorrow will, and every tomorrow will. I've lived more years than many of you in this room, less, fewer even than some others. But in all those days, I am yet to meet the person who does not carry a favourite line in their head, whether from a song or a book or a poem, or a quote from some book or other always at hand, or who doesn't have a favourite poem or writer that they always turn to, or a favourite band or song or piece of music that every time you play it, it is just like heaven. I'm also yet to meet the person who does not have a favourite other country or holiday destination, or a cherished phrase or expression in any language, or a favourite word in any language, or a favourite artist or gallery or photograph that they return to for whatever, reassurance, new knowledge, inspiration. We look and we look again, listen and listen again, read and read again, because there is always more to be known. And in all my time, I am yet to meet the person who has a favourite quadratic equation, a favourite illness, a favourite bone in their body, or dare I say, a favourite tooth. Don't think so. We exist as finite, physical beings, but with minds and imaginations tuned to infinite frequencies. We are and want more, need more than merely mottled material things. There's a quote from Saul Bellow's 1956 novel Seize the Day that when I'm recruiting students, I regularly use to get this point across. It is warm down here. On Broadway, it was still bright afternoon, and the gassy air was almost motionless under the leaden spokes of sunlight, and sawdust footprints lay about the doorways of butcher shops and fruit stores. And the great, great crowd, the inexhaustible current of millions of every race and kind pouring out, pressing round, of every age, of every genius, possessors of every human secret, antique and future, in every face the refinement of one particular motive or essence. I labour, I spend, I strive, I design, I love, I cling, I uphold, I give way, I envy, I long, I scorn, I die, I hide, I want. Faster, much faster than any man could make the tally. The driving individualism of this moment offers with one hand one element of American possibility, which is offset, or better, undercut by larger invisible forces within this novel. At the heart of Seize the Day, and it's very short, stands the indifferent mechanism of capitalism. The misguided main character, Tommy Wilhelm, he decides to hope for an upturn in his life by investing in the commodities markets. Market forces operate relentlessly at the core of the book like a machine, a metaphor not just representing capitalism and potential opportunity in the United States, but as a self-regulating machine that dictates lives without favour or interest. The indifference of the financial systems to Tommy's existential crises tick along through the novel. The shining numbers whir on the board, which sounds like a huge cage of artificial birds. It's an amazing image from one of the moments in the stock markets. Mechanization and marketization drive the novel, neither malignantly nor benignantly, but as a central matter of given fact. It's just like that. Tommy, uncomfortable in his Jewishness, submits to the promises of yield and financial salvation seemingly offered by the markets. This is a novel about many things. Prime among them, it is about numbers and it is about counting. And the without thought for the individual operations of the market. Set in the September days leading up to Yom Kippur, the Jewish Day of Atonement, Tommy either forgets or ignores the guidance offered in Exodus 30, verses 11 to 12. And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, When thou takest the sum of the children of Israel after their number, then shall they give every man a ransom for his soul unto the Lord when thou numberest them, that there be no plague among them when thou numberest them. The Talmud, on numerous occasions, forbids the counting of the Jewish people. But in a world where atonement has been replaced by accountancy, the negation of the individual human being, indeed, the negation of individuals as beings at all, is evident at various parts in the book, no more so than when Tommy Wilhelm encounters one of his father's friends, Mr. Pearls. He did not welcome this stranger. He began at once to find fault with him. Mr. Pearls carried a heavy cane with a crutch tip, dyed hair, skinny forehead. These were not reasons for bias. Nor was it Mr. Pearls' fault that Dr. Adler was using him, not wishing to have breakfast with his son alone. But a gruffer voice within Wilhelm spoke, asking, Who is this damn frazzle-faced herring with his dyed hair and his fish teeth and his drippy moustache? Another one of Dad's German friends. Where does he collect all these guys? What is the stuff on his teeth? I never saw such pointed crowns. Are they stainless steel or a kind of silver? How can a human face get into this condition? Ugh. Staring with his widely spaced grey eyes, Wilhelm sat, his broad back stooped under the sports jacket. He clasped his hands on the table with an implication of suppliance. Then he began to relent a little toward Mr. Pearls, beginning at the teeth. Each of those crowns represented a tooth ground to the quick, and estimating a man's grief with his teeth as 2% of the total, and adding to that his flight from Germany, and the probable cause of his wincing wrinkles, not to be confused with the wrinkles of his smile, it came to a sizable load. A survivor of the Holocaust and of the Nazi campaign of administrative massacres, as Hannah Arendt refers to them in Eichmann in Jerusalem from 1963, Mr. Pearls is a walking testament to the ultimate marketization of human existence. Industrial scale extermination of whole peoples was facilitated by counting groups and communities and individuals as stateless, as superfluous, as numbers on lists, stripped of their identities, their possessions, their clothing, the gold fillings in their teeth, and ultimately their lives. The banality of evil that Arendt wrote about as she reported on Eichmann's trial in 1961, and so brilliantly extended by Lindsay Stonebridge in her work on Arendt and how literature and fundamental human rights are inextricably linked. That banality of evil was located not necessarily in the inhumanity of the death camps, but in the fact that it was all organized as an impersonal bureaucracy, with men like Eichmann, akin to pen-pushing accountants in many respects, who oversaw the destruction of millions and millions of people. It was sheer thoughtlessness, something by no means identical with stupidity, that predisposed him, Eichmann, to become one of the greatest criminals of that period, writes Arendt. Thoughtlessness. The unthinking administration of mass production genocide, creating lists, assigning numbers, the mechanical elimination of multitudes. When Tommy in the novel opens bills that he cannot pay, his own inability to break free of the financial systems that enclose him is indelibly tied to the mechanization that made the Holocaust possible. Meanwhile, here were the bills to be paid. When he saw the two sums punched out so neatly on the cards, he cursed the company and its IBM equipment. It was technology and the hole punching machines created by IBM that the Nazis used to catalogue, number, and count the individuals relocated to ghettos and ultimately to the concentration camps. Counting, the incessant mechanics of the market, statistics not people, numbers not names, the mathematics of mass murder, the calculus of thoughtlessness. The indifferent and indiscriminate logic of the two systems are paralleled by Bellow throughout Seize the Day. The lesson from this is clear, I think. Reduce people to mere statistics, deny them their citizenship and identity. You can dispose of them without thinking. The obvious bottom line of this lecture is that literature is thinking, art is thinking, and that without them we diminish ourselves, just as we ourselves are diminished by the erosion of these subjects from our society, from our universities, and from our schools. It's not mathematics, Prime Minister, that we should be making mandatory to A level. It is literature in any and every language. It's art. It's the subjects that comprise the arts and the humanities that truly make the reckoning of who we are, who we have been, and who we can become. Without art to articulate the darkness, as well as be the light of being, we have nothing beyond merely existing in an abyss of thoughtless meaninglessness. We would be permanently all at sea, all of the time. As the Spanish philosopher, later politician, José Ortega y Gasset puts it in his 1932 essay In Search of Goethe from Within, life is in itself and forever shipwreck. This is the condition of our existence. And how do we respond? With culture, a swimming stroke, he refers to it as. That is the thing that buoys us up, holds us above the abyss, and without it, we drown. Culture is our resistance to the abyss of being. Culture, art, literature are not just a right, they are a necessity and a continuous one at that. Considering the abyss, this all gets a bit grim now, like it wasn't already. And also thinking about the Holocaust and how literature responds or tries to respond and to what exists beyond the expression of language. This somewhat inevitably takes me to the work of another philosopher, this time French, and that is Maurice Blanchot. I don't have time here to look at his 1980 work, The Writing of the Disaster, about the Holocaust. So instead, I want to look briefly at his 1948 essay, Literature and the Right to Death, from which I so obviously culled the title for this lecture. Thank you, Maurice. At the heart of his argument here, Blanchot articulates the eternal double impulse or double bind of the writer to put into words that which precedes language, to voice a nothingness that exists beyond expression, forever aware of the impossibility of that task. When I first begin, I do not speak in order to say something. Rather, a nothing demands to speak. Nothing speaks. Nothing finds its being in speech, and the being of speech is nothing. This formulation explains why literature's ideal has been the following: to say nothing, to speak in order to say nothing. For nothingness to speak, it must become language, and instantaneously it negates its own prior potentiality as nothingness. Okay. Emily Dickinson, for me, achieves this introduction of nothingness and of silence in her work through her copious use of dashes throughout her poems. Meaning, as Blanchot sees it, is automatically challenged as the primary motivation or task of a writer. Meaning, at best, is secondary. Tell that to school kids, and even some. Instead, as Blanchot sees it, the continual challenge of literature is to encounter the abyss, out of which language springs and back into which it will return. This abyss encountered in full awareness that it can never bring the abyss fully into language. that which precedes language, silence and nothingness, remains forever beyond expression. And yet, it is a necessity to make the attempt to put it into language, even if we know it won't happen, even if the results are flawed words and stubborn sounds that fall short every time they attempt to make the passage. Meaning ultimately can only exist in and because of nothingness. It is this nothingness that makes all of our words and literature possible, much like our not being makes being possible. To attempt to elucidate this, for my last example, and to complete our return to shore this evening, one last poem. To quote the late Welsh poet R.S. Thomas, who's great, I think, whose life also was one that was dedicated as a service as a minister in the church in Wales. From his last collection in his lifetime, No Truce from the Furies, Thomas writes, "I turn now not to the Bible, but to Wallace Stevens. My time remaining is short, so my choice from Stevens will also be short, a poem first published in 1921. I turn to Stevens for many reasons. One of these is his own admission in a letter dated the 1st of April, 1955, 4 months and 1 day before his death. When I have time to read, I love Vidlay, a Russian contemporary, as much as I love Maurice Blanchot. Another reason is that Stevens had also identified how nothingness instructs our understandings and calibrations of this world. And he had made this identification some time before Blanchot, as it happens. The snowman. One must have a mind of winter to regard the frost and the boughs of the pine trees crusted with snow, and have been cold a long time to behold the junipers shagged with ice, the spruces rough in the distant glitter of the January sun, and not to think of any misery in the sound of the wind, in the sound of a few leaves, which is the sound of the land, full of the same wind that is blowing in the same bare place, for the listener who listens in the snow, and, nothing himself, beholds nothing that is not there, and the nothing that is. I could talk about those three nothings and the double negation in the last two lines, possibly for eternity, but I will spare you that this evening. A nothing that is, a generative nothingness, positive as sound. This is where we locate our response to the abyss, to the near oblivion of this particular evacuated scene. To be here and not to think requires that we become truly and absolutely thoughtless, akin to snowmen with nothing to behold. Not to think is not to be nothing. Not to think is not to be human, a contradiction and an impossibility. We are conscious of the nothingness that exists within this world, as well as a nothingness beyond our sensory capacities. We infer or suggest interpretations, misery in the sound of the wind, because to do otherwise is not to think, to be as nothing within an eternal abyss of nothingness. But we are, or we are not, or should not be, thoughtless. And because we are not thoughtless, we act. We take action, as Arendt understands it, to make change happen in the world. We write. In certain corners of the world, literature is once again, but maybe is always under attack. Sometimes the attack is in full sight, brazen, as with the latest examples in Florida. But there are more covert attacks on literature and on art on a daily basis. And not just, I'm afraid, in the United States. Schools in this jurisdiction that previously had 3 or 4 or even 5 A-level classes now have 1, possibly 2, if you're lucky. A combination of government policy, curriculum change and manipulation, short-termist decision-making is stripping our society of that which defines us. Recurrent funding cuts to the arts mean reduced accessibility to the multiple different ways that we can know ourselves. They mean reduced access for lower income individuals who see a career pathway closed down even before it begins. The arts retreat, and fewer higher education institutions offer the degree programs needed. And the fees rise, and only those who can afford those higher fees and that line of study can become part of a self-selecting elite, of a self-fulfilling prophecy that determines that we no longer need so many programs or student places on such courses because, look, no one's taking them. Perfect. And the market resets on its own terms, indifferent to the greater need we have as humans being on the earth. The closure or diminishment of university degree programs is no longer an early warning system. It is surely a sign that it's too late. I listened to a previous vice-chancellor of this university on more than one occasion make the case that the market decides what degrees students should take and will take, and that the pendulum had swung decidedly toward the STEM subjects and away from the arts and humanities. Between 1995-96 and the year 2020, the number of students taking French at GCSE here fell from 14,000 to 4,000 and to 3,500 in 2021. Perhaps he had a data-driven point. But to accept such laissez-faire determinations of our education system by the market, that is both short-sighted and corrosive to our society and our humanity. We need more literature, not less. More languages, not fewer. More art, not less. If we are to be in contact with ourselves as human beings. It is 2023 and our planet is burning. And in the third decade of the 21st century, in parts of the United States, some people are burning books again. A new disinformation age is upon us, eroding the core meanings and values of our societies, replacing them with vacuous, populist propaganda routines sent viral by fake social media accounts. We have been beset by hollow men. Just look at the latest self-aggrandizements of Trump and Johnson in the last week or two if you need further evidence. Beset by hollow men who bequeath us only ashes. History may not necessarily repeat, but its echoes are certainly unmistakable. In America, misinformed and politically misled, right-leaning, anti-woke, cultural wedge fanaticists are removing and banning books that do not conform to their narrow definitions of safe, normal, white identity. The removal of Amanda Gorman's inauguration poem, The Hill We Climb, from the Bob Graham Education Center in Miami Lakes just a couple of weeks ago, because one parent complained about the context of a text that she admitted she'd never read. That's just the latest example in the United States of a move against writing and understanding, but particularly against the understanding of Black and minority experience in the United States. In 2021-22 in Florida, a total of 565 books were banned. PEN America's index of banned books across the United States for the same period ran to 2,535 books. This is the direct result of individual campaigns or of local, district, county, or in some instances, state-sanctioned policies not to think. Choosing, indeed legislating, not to think, to become thoughtlessness. And choosing complacently against knowing for the next generation and the next. This is the way the world ends. Not with a bang, even less with a whimper, but with ashes in our hearts and minds of winter. Thank you.